Hey, Oliver, this is another episode of It's Life.
We're back. We're back. I love it, man. I love it. For those of you who are tuning in to this episode, I really hope that, first of all, welcome. If it's your first time, hearing our voices, be sure and go back and check out the other episodes. I feel like we've been on a journey with these episodes, and so come get on the journey with us. For those of you who are returning, thank you for returning. We're having a good time, man. We're talking about life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a wonderful life.
Yeah. And all of its curves and twists and turns and hills and valleys and great scenery and desolation, if you will. It's all one package, man. And so we're learning how to, in some cases in real time, learning how to navigate this thing. And I think this is going to be one of those in real, on the fly in real time conversations about aspects of life that we, if it was up to us to choose, we would not choose.
No, I guess not. I think that might be a little bit of our issue, is because we have a perspective that we want to be able to, an expectation that this experience should always feel good.
Interesting.
That it should always feel good. And that, I think, creates a lot of our self-induced challenges, because, one of the big things that I focus on a lot is understanding. And all you're getting, get understanding. And when we walk around trying to figure this thing out as though it's new, we're just on the footsteps, on the heels of someone that preceded us. This experience called life, it ain't new. We just passing through it.
Right.
And so because we have a tendency to think that, it's mine, and I'm supposed to have all that I want the way I want it. And then when you get hit with reality, then you disappointed because you ain't getting it the way you want it.
Interesting.
And so let's try to, formulate this thing in a perspective that, hey, what happens is life. That's it.
Yeah.
And so let's deal with it. And that's what the navigation is dealing with. It's life. Good, bad, or indifferent, ugly, pretty. Deal with it. It ain't always gonna feel good.
It's not always gonna feel good. That's a very good, those are very good parameters in the setup for this conversation that we're about to have, because that, in light of what we're about to talk about, could very well be unpopular opinion.
Absolutely, because it don't feel good.
Right.
It ain't gonna feel good. I mean, but we can't remove it. We can't change it. I mean, we can't make it go away. But I think we can understand it. That will in turn allow us to navigate it a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. You would use that word "navigate" too, because that in lieu of what we're talking about. So for those of you who are like, "Hey, you kind of, what are you talking about?" Like, we're talking about in the news. Everybody by this time has seen the Tyree Nichols story, and if you haven't seen the video, many have seen the video. If you haven't, at least you by now have heard about it. And there's so many different nuances to this, at least from my vantage point, that weren't always the case in some of these other instances. And so for you to set it up with the parameters of, hey, part of the reason why our experience as participants, part of the reason that our experience is the way it is as participants is because we expect life to be a certain way. And when it isn't that way, we now are spending energy navigating disappointment as opposed to navigating life itself. That's interesting. That's one part of the parameters of the setup. The other thing is that I'm now seeing, or I was seeing with this conversation around Nichols, is that we're focusing a lot more on navigation than maybe even the politics around it or the action itself. There's a lot of talk about trauma, and there's a lot of, I saw a lot of stuff on social media where people are like, I'm not watching the video because I am protecting my trauma response, or I'm, protecting my trigger response, or what. There's a lot of mental health talk coming out of this particular event, more so than I saw in previous events. So it's interesting that you would talk about the navigation piece, because that seems to be uh, just as much at the forefront as the action itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm wondering why that's the case, to be honest. I mean, I know why that's the case, but I'm wondering why now as opposed to earlier on.
I don't know. I mean, you're seeing something that I'm not particularly, I guess, seeing it that way.
Mhm.
But just, look, this is traumatic to understand that the way in which this is narrated, the way this is being formulated,
Mm-hmm.
it's different because the elements of race is not in it.
Right. Right. That's the
The
next part.
element the elements of race is not in this, in the sense that it has been in the past.
Right. Right.
And I think it allows us to have to reevaluate. And I'm getting ready to say something that I've not spoken of about it before, but it's evident in everything that we deal with, and it's culture.
Okay.
I spent 12 years in law enforcement and security.
Mm-hmm.
It has shown me a lot about a culture that is different than anything that I have experienced, based on the fact of what the parameters are and the expectations are of law enforcement. It's something that is very, very unique in our society that the average person will not and probably cannot understand. And what this particular incident has allowed us to see is that it doesn't necessarily determine, it's not a racial issue
Mm-hmm.
as much as it is a culture issue
Okay.
inside of a very unique organization, or called the police department.
Mm-hmm.
They're asked to do a very unique job. They're asked to do something that only it's you compare it to, what do they call them? First responders,
Mm-hmm.
fire department, police officers. Those are those careers that run towards problems.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they do. And it's a very interesting because on the fire department side, that's all they do is run towards problems.
Right.
The police department is asked to do something a little bit more difficult. They're asked to serve as being an agent of service and run towards problems.
Mm-hmm.
That's a difficult thing because the problems that they typically are running towards are not defined until they get there.
Okay.
Are not defined until they get there. And so that type of a mentality that needs to be able to do that is, I think it's kind of unrealistic, to be perfectly honest with you. It's kind of unrealistic.
Mm-hmm.
You can have, I've known of police officers stopping a car for speed and get killed.
Mm-hmm.
I've known a police officer to go places and abuse their power because they're in that uniform.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have that shield and that authority to represent the state because of their authority, their shield, or they called it the shield. And it's a very peculiar position
Mm-hmm.
to the citizens that have to view their service and their enforcement, because they're to enforce the law and then serve the people at the same time.
Right. Do you feel like that
So
narrative has been shifted? So you talked about instances where it's what's supposed to be a routine traffic stop that turns into something fatal. Do you feel like experiences like that have caused, because it's interesting what you said. So here, I'm going to say all this to shape my question. Very interesting what you said. Made me think when you said this. Uh, the difference, you talked about firefighters. It's very clearly defined what they're running into every time, almost. Every once in a while there's a call where like it's not really a fire, but it's something else. with with the police department, what you're saying is that the narrative is not defined until they arrive. And there are often cases where, because you're walking into something that is not clearly defined, by the time it is defined, something fatal happens. Do you feel like from your experience with law enforcement that for some law enforcement groups that it has changed the narrative in a way that says, okay, these particular areas, these particular people, these particular times of year, here's what the scenario might be, and define it ahead of time, which maybe causes some of the stuff that we see because maybe they defined it in a way that's really not what it should be, and go in with that definition in mind?
all of the above.
Okay.
All of the above. There is no question that people use all of the context clues and all of the awareness that they can in any and every situation. And they should, as well, they should. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm saying you can't remove that. But at the same time, you've got to be able to serve and enforce. So if there has been a neighborhood that has had three homicides in 1 week, that's going to play in your psyche. Mm-hmm. That's impossible for it not to. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's only people who live in that neighborhood got that in their psyche. Less more outsider coming into the neighborhood gonna have. Just like if you go to a neighborhood that doesn't have any homicides in it, you have a tendency probably to think a little bit differently. But that's natural. it's like you're going to use your senses and your awareness to be able to manage yourself, because here's unfortunately the sayings of many, I'm not going to say all, but many law enforcement. I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6.
Carried by 6, yeah. Yeah, yeah. That's that's tough, man, because here's the serve piece, right? Is, and it's interesting you would say that as well. I watched a video where a guy was talking about the fact that all of the things that law enforcement is supposed to do, they're not doing anymore. So what is the point of them being around, right? And if you think back to, I can't really say that I grew up during an era like this, but there's an era that many can point to who are older than we are, to a time, can point to a time where the law enforcement knew everybody, and you knew who it was. You knew who officer so and so was because he was around and he was in the neighborhood. He knew your kids. He knew, right? So there's certain nuances. So Uncle so and so is kind of, he a little crazy. So don't pay him no mind. He's not gonna hurt nobody. As opposed to now, Uncle so and so looks like a threat. We don't know Uncle so and so, so we don't know what he's gonna do. So our first inclination is we're gonna put Uncle so and so down because he might hurt me. Whereas we don't have that relationship that we had in the beginning. And so the serve piece, and this is me from the outside looking in, you would have a very different perspective, obviously, being in law enforcement.
No, I think you're absolutely true.
Okay.
You're absolutely true. I think that the dynamics of our communities have changed, though.
True.
And the fact is that a lot of the people that have been were policing our neighborhoods were from our neighborhoods.
Right.
That's not the case in many of these situations today.
Yeah.
And here's the bigger part to that is that law enforcement has become more about law enforcement than about service.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what we're trying to do is to interject service into a dynamic that is so very different than anybody in the past could have ever imagined. Here's the thing. We're addressing issues like gun violence, and we're talking about things like removing guns from the streets, taking guns out of people's hands and stuff. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. They just use guns to do it. And until we address the people element, we focusing on stuff that guns don't kill people. People kill people.
Yeah.
And we're focusing on the guns, like the gun get up and pull a trigger by itself.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to, and this is just me talking. So for those of you who are listening, I'm not, don't take my word as law, but this is just me thinking this through. I feel like that speaks to where we are as a society. And I think what we don't want to say out loud is that we don't feel like it's going to get any better. So because we don't feel like it's going to get any better, what can we do to kind of level this thing out, or maybe tip it a little bit in the other direction? And so we don't necessarily feel like the people will change. So if we can restrict what the people have access to, organically, it may cause some of this stuff to decrease. And so many are not even focusing on the people side of it. What are the relationships that we need to have with law enforcement in our community? What are some of the things that need to take place in terms of being able to change the narrative around how we see law enforcement. What needs to happen as it in regards to highlighting the individuals who are doing what they what they signed up to do, and they're doing it very well. Like, how many of those stories do we see, right? We're not spending a lot of time and capacity in that area, because I feel like deep down we just don't want to say this, but deep down we feel like, oh well, it's gonna always be like that. So since that's gonna always be like that, what can we do over here to put some more weight on the scale, so to speak?
Well, you know, I think you hit it on the head. It's about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly don't think apart from the relationships, we are here's the thing. We are a very violent society. And this speaks back to a little bit of what you were talking about, the emotional trauma that we are dealing with, a society that has viewed and has accepted this type of violence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's becoming a lot to bear. It's becoming to be a lot to bear. And it's and basically it really goes back to what you were saying. And it's like, and there is no hope in sight.
Mm-hmm.
There's no hope in sight. I want to challenge it. I want to challenge that in the sense that love is the answer, is establishing relationships. See, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to correct this thing overnight. It's going to take people wanting to engage one another in a manner in which that they can see the value of one another as being important. We've got to validate the need to need one another. We've got to speak to the fact that I need you.
Mm-hmm.
You are a part of, we have this thing called humanity in common.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not here, I lose out.
Okay.
I lose out when you're not here. So I see you as valuable instead of not. But before I can see you as valuable, I have to see myself as valuable.
There it is.
I have to see myself as valuable. And a lot of things that I talk about in the book, Love Made Simple, it has to do with first things find, you've got to know who you are. You've got to find self. I think we try to identify someone else's weakness and how it conflicts with us. And that's where our conflict starts, because we don't know who we are. And if that situation, someone else's situation opposes this idea to who I am, then you're a threat to me. And I don't see the differences between us as being valuable rather than being a confrontational. See, you and I are not the same. Mm-hmm. You bring things I don't know. And I learn from what you bring. I'm not intimidated or feeling like that you got something I don't have, but I look at it as saying, what I have is for you and what you have is for me. I see value in that. That's a relationship. And we don't have that mindset. We see our neighbors as our enemies when our neighbors were supposed to be our assets.
Yeah.
We struggle in our society as it relates to just being able to understand humanity. I mean, humanity is a collection of human beings that looks look out for each other's best interests. We don't have that. We're not taught that. We're not exposed to that.
Yeah, you're right. It's every man for himself at this point.
That doesn't have a good ending.
As we can clearly see, right?
It doesn't have a good ending.
And
But
I
it
think
but it affects the next generation too. Go ahead.
it does. And I think those are some of the conversations we're not having, right? Because we can go exactly where we always go with this Nichols situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now the one thing that you talked about this early on, the one thing that we can't draw a straight line to in this particular case is race. It's a crooked line, right? But generally, in all of these instances, the conversation is all the same. And the conversation is not always about, and here's where it gets really controversial. And I'm not saying there, I'm not saying I'm leaning one way or the other. I'm just saying we don't have holistic conversations. So what doesn't always come up is what you talked about, community and relationship and how we've been taught to view the world, and the fact that that does have a direct correlation to how we act, and that some actions, and again, I'm not talking about any one case in particular, I'm just talking about having a holistic conversation. Some actions require accountability. All actions require accountability, good or bad. And accountability is not one sided. So accountability is not just on the part of the community, it is on the part of law enforcement, right? So we don't often, it's easy to go one direction. It's not as easy to go that direction in this conversation because the officers were black. So I even saw a video where somebody literally was like, "Hey, so what you gonna say now?" Like, you can't say the same thing you said in all these other conversations because it wasn't us this time. Right. So that just speaks to how one dimensional the conversations have been. What are we going to do about adding some dimension to these conversations? Because, and do we even believe that it's possible? Do we believe that we can create community? Do we believe that we can uh, create an environment where everybody is looking at this from a humanity standpoint, and people are now beginning to create partnerships and create relationships that speak directly to the mending of some of these things that we have? Or are we going to continue to have the one-dimensional conversations that we have?
Yeah. I mean, that's a choice. We've got to choose it. I look back at, granted, I grew up, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. And at the time we're talking about, I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia at that point. And what it would have been perceived as the ghetto,
Mhm.
we lived in a row house, but we owned the house. It wasn't a rental. My parents had bought a house, but we governed ourselves. We
Mhm.
we our community. We had a my parents were a part of this thing that they called the Parents Club
Mhm.
in our community.
Mhm.
So we all were looking out for one another. Our community policed our community.
Mhm.
That's not the same anymore.
No, it's not. It's not.
And I think there's a lot of things. I don't know if we've talked about it, but this experience called life, the foundation of it is the family.
Hmm.
And again, we talked about this last time as it relates to that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we get our perspective from? It starts at the family.
Starts at the family.
That's where it starts. Now, how we view it and how we then begin to exercise it, it's going to play itself out on these events that are going to happen moment by moment in our journey. Is going to determine how that perspective is going to play itself out.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got to begin to change the dynamics. We can't ask somebody to do something for us that we've got to be able to learn how to do for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I say that's when law enforcement or policemen could be of people who served us, they could add value to our communities. It's because we had a community we were governing ourselves in a way in which, if somebody came into the community acting a fool, we knew about it. The parents knew about it. And cool. All right, so we're gonna wrap this up. So, Oliver, let them know how they can reach you.
You can reach me if you're a social media person. You can either look up my name, Oliver Marcelle, and follow me that way, or you can look up Denali LLC, DENOLI LLC, on all social media. You can email me, my first name, Oliver @denali.org. Author, speaker, coach, author of the book Overcoming the Man Laws. So get with me. I want to help make your relationship be the one of your dreams, both personally and professionally.
Cool. And I'm Juan Lee. I'm an author and a speaker, also a transformational speaker, and also a thought leader in the power of love. I'm also the founder of a nonprofit called Clear Journey, where we support military veterans and their families in financial literacy, mental health, and self-improvement. And you can reach me at either of those locations at info@Juan Lee, the author, or you can reach me at info@clearjourney.org. And until next time, I tell you, we all have to realize that every moment is just a part of life. It's what we have to deal with every day. So understand that it's just life. It's life, what we're doing. Next time. Have a great one. Talk to you then.